The mess hall on Deck 7 of the Albedo Brave served the same meal on the same rotation it had served for 11 months. Protein paste in 3 colors that tasted like 2. Compressed grain squares that softened in liquid if you gave them time, which most people didn't. A pale broth that the clones called Camino soup without affection, which arrived in the same scratched metal canteen it always arrived in, which was collected by the same maintenance droid at the same time every cycle. Nobody complained about the food. You stopped complaining about things after a certain number of months at the front. Not because the things stopped being worth complaining about, because the energy required to complain had been quietly redirected to staying alert, to not sleeping too deeply, to the specific mathematics of what you needed to keep doing your job versus what you merely wanted. The food was adequate. The food continued. That was enough. This is what routine looks like in wartime. Not comfort, not peace. Just the continuation of small things that prove, each time they happen, that the structure holding everything up is still standing. The Albedo Brave was 3 days out from the Outer Rim Theater and running standard transit configuration, minimum crew at stations, reduced power to non-essential systems, the specific hum of a ship that is between things, between the last deployment and the next briefing, between one part of the Clone Wars and another part of the Clone Wars, which had been going for 3 years now, and had long since stopped feeling like a thing that would end and started feeling like a condition. Like weather, like something you adjusted your behavior around without expecting it to change. Below decks, in a corridor on level 3 that connected the equipment storage bay to the auxiliary engineering section, a 13-year-old was about to make a mistake. Cal Kestis had been at this for 40 minutes. The corridor was not a training room. It had not been cleared for this purpose. There were supply crates stacked along the port wall, grey Duraplast containers marked with guild inventory numbers, secured with magnetic locks, going somewhere that someone needed them. They were not obstacles placed for pedagogical effect. They were simply there, the way things on working military vessels are simply there. Functional, incidental, completely indifferent to whatever was happening around them. Chief Master Jaro Tapal stood at the far end of the corridor, with his arms folded across his chest and the expression he wore when he was watching, and had not yet decided whether what he was watching was worth commenting on. Tapal was a large man. Lasat were built on a different scale than humans. Broader through the shoulders, longer in the limb, carrying their mass with an unhurried solidity that made even standing still look deliberate. He had been a Jedi for longer than Cal had been alive. His face had the quality of something that had been tested many times and had not broken, which was different from a face that had never been tested at all, and Cal was old enough now to understand the difference. What they were doing was not a formal training session. It did not have a name. It had come out of a conversation earlier in the day. A question Cal had asked that Tapal had answered by walking him to the nearest available space and saying simply, "Show me what you mean." The exercise was straightforward in description and increasingly not straightforward in practice. Cal was attempting to move 3 crates simultaneously. Not large ones, not the ones along the wall, but 3 small containers he'd brought out himself, each one about the size of a helmet, holding them in the air in a specific configuration, and rotating that configuration while maintaining uniform tension on all 3. 1 crate was simple. 2 required attention. 3, he was discovering, required something he hadn't fully identified yet. He could hold 2 easily now. 3 months ago, he couldn't. He was aware of this progress in the background of his mind, which was exactly where Tapal had told him to put it Awareness of progress belongs in the background, like knowing where the exits are. You know it. You don't look at it while you're working. The third crate was the problem. Every time he reached for the third, one of the other two drifted, not dramatically, not a drop, just a slight loss of intention, the force equivalent of a hand you didn't quite clench. And then he'd correct, and the third would drift. He'd been cycling through this for 40 minutes and was beginning to suspect that the problem was not the third crate. He let them down. All three. Gently, at least. That part he could do. He looked at the floor for a moment. Behind him, Tapple said nothing. This was one of the things Cal had learned about his master over 14 months. The silence after a failed attempt was not judgment. It was space. Tapal was giving him room to find his own assessment before adding another voice to the room. Some masters rushed to correct. Tapal waited until the student had already begun to see the problem, and then he pointed at what they were already looking toward. "I'm reaching for the third," Cal said. "Yes. And when I reach, I lose the first two. What does that tell you?" Cal thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking. That I'm treating them as separate. That I'm moving between them instead of... He stopped. Instead of what? He didn't have the word yet. He could feel the shape of the idea, but not its edges. Like something in water. Present, blurred, not quite graspable. Tapal crossed the corridor in 4 unhurried steps and crouched, surprisingly graceful for someone his size, until he was at eye level with the 3 crates sitting on the deck. He looked at them the way you look at something you understand completely and are deciding how to describe. "The force does not move between things," he said. "It is not a thread you run from point to point. It is..." He paused. Not searching for words, Tapal always knew his words, deciding which ones would land in the space Cal was currently in. "It is weather. It is already in the room. You are not sending it. You are asking it to... Not wait. That is the wrong word." Another pause. "The force asks to be met, not chased." Cal looked at the crates. "Try again," Tapal said. "Don't reach for the third. Let all 3 exist in the same space you're already occupying." He stood up, stepped back, folded his arms again. Cal raised the first crate, the second. And then, instead of extending himself outward toward the third, he tried something he couldn't quite describe. He simply included it. Let his awareness expand to contain all 3 without prioritizing any of them. The way you hear a room's ambient sounds without listening to them individually. All 3 rose. They held. They held for 7 seconds, which was longer than they'd held all morning. And then Cal felt the effort of it. The real effort, not the reaching, but the sustaining. And they came down again. Gently. All 3. He stood there breathing. Tapal made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite neutrality. Somewhere in the register of noted, continue. "Oh, again," he said. "You found it for 7 seconds. Find it for 8. They worked for another 20 minutes. Cal reached 8 seconds, then 9, then lost it completely for 4 attempts in a row, then found something that lasted 12. Tapal said very little during this period. What he said was precise and infrequent, the way he always spoke, as if he'd calculated the exact number of words the moment required and refused to exceed the budget. When he ended the session, he ended it without announcement. He simply uncrossed his arms, turned, and started walking back toward the junction. Cal gathered the 3 small crates and stacked them where they belonged. This was also part of training, he'd learned, though Tapal had never said so directly, and possibly Tapal thought of it differently. But Cal had decided on his own that how you left a space you'd used was part of the practice, that it mattered. He caught up with his master at the junction. They walked in the quiet that had become comfortable over a year of walking in it together. Into Pal's quarters, small, like all the officers' quarters on a Venator, functional in the way military spaces were always functional, which meant arranged around the assumption that the person occupying them had a purpose more important than the quarters themselves. There was a shelf. On the shelf, a comlink in its charging cradle, a mission datapad with a blinking indicator that meant unread report, and a sealed case roughly the size of a fist, dark grey without markings. T'Pol crossed to the shelf, picked up the comlink, listened to a short transmission from the bridge, something about course correction, adjustment to the transit timeline, minor turbulence expected in the next sector. He acknowledged it in 2 words, set the comlink back in its cradle. He did not look at the case. The case sat exactly as it had always sat. It had sat in precisely the same position, on shelves, aboard 4 different assignments. T'Pol had never explained it to Cal. Cal had noticed it the way you notice things in spaces you spend time in. Catalogued, filed, not pursued. There were things about his master that were not his to pursue. He was learning which ones those were. Inside the case, a kyber crystal, uncut, small enough to fit in a closed palm. From a lightsaber that had been destroyed on a mission that had happened before Cal was assigned to T'Pol, jarred on a planet that Cal didn't know the name of, in circumstances T'Pol had mentioned once in passing and never elaborated on. He'd shown it to Cal once, briefly, a moment that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The case open, the crystal visible, and then the case closed again. He'd said, "This is from before. Things from before are worth keeping. Nothing else." The crystal sat in the dark of its case, unremarkable, present. T'Pol picked up his datapad, began reading the unread report, sat down at his desk with the same measured unhurriedness with which he did everything, and the room settled back into the quiet of a ship between things, between theatres, between the last moment and the next one, on a transport vessel in a different sector of the same sky. A girl named Trilla Suduri was sitting cross-legged on the equipment bench in the ship's secondary hold, watching stars. The hold was not designed for watching stars. It had a single viewport, small, set low in the hull, originally meant for equipment inspection, that offered an imperfect and slightly scratched view of whatever was outside. The scratches made the stars look like they were behind frosted glass. Trilla had decided this was not a flaw. She had decided the frosted effect made them look further away, which made the space between here and them feel appropriately large. She liked being reminded that space was large. It made her smaller problems feel correctly scaled. She was 11. Her master, Siri Junda, was at a fold-down desk in the same hold, reviewing the mission report. The mission had been in the Outer Rim. A supply chain interdiction, a relatively quiet operation, the kind that got categorized as mid-priority and executed by small teams, because the Republic had learned 3 years into this war that not every problem required a battalion. The mission was complete. The transport was 3 hours from the handoff point, where they'd transfer to a proper cruiser and file the paperwork and be done with it. The dangerous part was over. This was the easy part. Sere and Trilla both knew it, and neither said so, because you developed a particular relationship with the easy parts of missions. You didn't name them, in case naming them changed what they were. You just inhabited them. You let the quiet be quiet. Sari wrote something on her datapad, deleted it, wrote something else. She had the focused stillness of someone who had been doing paperwork on military vessels for long enough that the discomfort of it had become invisible. She bit the edge of her stylus. Trilla knew, without looking over, that she was biting the stylus. It was a habit Siri had when she was choosing between two ways to phrase something. "You're going to break the stylus," Trilla said, still looking at the stars. "I've had this stylus for 4 years. And look at it." A pause. Then, without turning, "I'm not looking at it." Trilla almost smiled. This was the texture of them, easy, lateral, built from enough accumulated time together that they didn't need to construct conversations from scratch anymore. Siri had not been her assigned master in the formal temple sense. The assignment had been more organic than that. A series of missions where they'd work together. A recognition that Siri's approach and Trilla's mind fit together in a particular way. An arrangement that had formalized itself without much announcement. Trilla was not sure Siri had planned any of it. She wasn't sure Siri planned things in the way she herself did. Trilla was a planner, a cataloger, the kind of student who organized her notes by date and cross-referenced them. Siri was the kind of Jedi who would say, "The best plans are the ones you can abandon and mean it." They disagreed about this. They disagreed about other things too. Texts, techniques, the relative weight of precision versus intuition in combat training. They disagreed in the way that people disagree when they respect each other enough to be honest, which meant the disagreements were good for both of them. Trilla looked at the stars through the scratched viewport. She was not thinking about the mission. She was not thinking about the report or the handoff or the transit back to Coruscant. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which was something she had learned to do from Siri, to let the mind rest without filling it, to sit in the space between thoughts without anxiety about what the next thought would be. Outside, the stars moved slowly with the ship's drift. Everything was in the easy part. On the Albedo Brave, the clones of the 13th Battalion were performing maintenance. This is a sentence that requires no drama, because it contains none. Maintenance was what soldiers did in the intervals. They cleaned weapons they had cleaned the day before, so they ran diagnostics on armor that showed no errors. They organized equipment that was already organized. They did these things not because the things needed doing in any urgent sense, but because occupied hands produced occupied minds, and occupied minds in transit were easier to manage than unoccupied ones. CT-1477, known as SATCH, was applying solvent to the barrel assembly of a DC-15 blaster rifle with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He had been doing this for 20 minutes. He had been a soldier for his entire conscious life. He had no memory of not being a soldier, which was not a hardship he had ever named as a hardship, because he had no frame of reference for the alternative. He understood the war, his role in it, and the basic structure of his unit and its command. He understood these things the way you understand the grammar of your own language, not as rules, but as the self-evident shape of how things worked. He knew Jedi Master Jaro Tapal's face. He had seen it in briefings, in corridors, in the mess hall. He had trained beside this unit for 3 months. He knew the Padawan's face too, the young human who moved through the ship with the careful posture of someone learning to take up the right amount of space. Cal. He'd heard the name said by other Jedi officers. Cal Kestis, 13, maybe 14. Earnest in the way young people were earnest when they had been given something worth caring about. CT-1477 had nothing against either of them. This is the thing the chapter cannot say directly, but cannot omit. The clones of the 13th Battalion were not different from the men Cal had trained beside for 3 months. They ate the same food. They maintained the same equipment. They complained, occasionally, and without heat, about the same things. Satch had lent Cal a tool once, a specific calibration instrument that Cal had needed for something in his quarters. And Cal had returned it the next day, cleaned, with a nod that communicated thank you without requiring words. They were not enemies. They were not enemies yet. Inside every one of them, in the tissue that connected their minds to whatever had made them what they were, something waited. It had been waiting for 3 years. It was very good at waiting. In a room somewhere that was not a ship and not a battlefield, a room with columns and a high curved ceiling, and a view of Coruscant from an altitude that made everything below it look organized and deliberate. A man sat alone with an order that had already been written. He did not look at it. He didn't need to look at it. He had written it a long time ago, when the war was young and its shape was still being decided. He had written it in the understanding that wars were not decided on battlefields. Wars were decided before the battle, by whoever had already arranged for the battle to end in a specific way, regardless of what happened during it. He had arranged. He was patient. He had been patient for a very long time. Cal Kestis fell asleep at 14:30 ship time. He had not intended to fall asleep. He was between things, between the training and dinner, between dinner and the evening briefing. He didn't actually need to attend, but attended anyway, because not attending felt wrong in a way he hadn't fully examined. He lay down on his bunk for what he was thinking of as 20 minutes. He was asleep in 4. The bunk was narrow, military specification. The pillow was functional in a way that had never aspired to more than functionality. The light through the viewport was the flat, distant light of deep space. No planet nearby, no star large enough at this distance to cast direction, just the ambient light of a galaxy going about its business. He thought, for a moment before sleep took him, about the corridor, about the 3 crates, about the 12 seconds, the longest hold, the moment when he'd stopped reaching and started including, and all 3 had simply been there together, waiting in the space he'd already occupied. The Force asks to be met, not chased. He almost had it. He could feel the shape of it, the way you feel the shape of a word. In another language that describes something your own language doesn't have a word for. He would try again tomorrow. He would get to 15 seconds, maybe 20, and T'Pol would say noted, continue, and they would work for another 40 minutes in a borrowed corridor that was not a training room, but was, for those 40 minutes, exactly what it needed to be. He did not know it was the last normal afternoon of his life. How would he? He was 13, asleep in a narrow bunk on a ship between theaters, exhausted from practicing patience in a hallway with supply crates. The war was a condition of the world he'd grown up in. The Republic was the water he swam in. The Jedi Order was the structure that had shaped every year of his conscious life. These were not things he thought about. They were things he was. Tomorrow was already there. He was sure of it. He could feel it the way you feel the floor under your feet, solid, assumed, not something you check. He slept. In the main hangar, a clone named Satch set down his cleaning cloth and picked up his comlink as a coded transmission arrived. He read it once. His hand, for just a moment, went very still. Then it moved, the way trained hands move. When they have received an order they were built to receive, without hesitation, without the pause that a choice would require. Because this was not a choice. This was the thing the pause had always been waiting inside of. He did not feel what he was about to do. This is the only mercy in the entire story, and it belongs to no one you're following. Down the corridor, into T'Pol's quarters, the sealed case sat on its shelf. The crystal inside had not changed. The ship's engines shifted register, a subtle change, almost imperceptible. The specific sound of a Venator whose crew configuration was altering in a way that had no name in the standard acoustic catalogue, because nothing like it had happened before. In his bunk, on the edge of the deepest part of sleep, Cal Kestis felt it. Not with his ears, with something else. His eyes opened into a room that was exactly the same room he had closed them in, lit by the same light, carrying the same ambient hum. But somewhere in the space between his spine and the bunk beneath him, something had changed. He lay still, listening. In the old Republic standard calendar, it was the month of Remnara, the month of what remains. In the imperial calendar that would be used to record this day, it was the first day of Vigilus, the month of vigilance. Both calendars agree on the date. Neither calendar has a word for what the date became. The soldiers who survived it never used either calendar to describe when it happened. They said, before the order, after the order. That was the only division of time that mattered anymore. 3 days before the order came through, a clone on a different ship, the 501st posting near Utapau, wrote a letter to no one in particular that was later found in a destroyed datapad. The letter said nothing extraordinary. It described the food. It described the view from the viewport. It said the war was almost over. Everyone was saying the war was almost over. That letter was never sent. It remains the most ordinary thing found in the wreckage of that week. The first thing that was wrong was the quiet. Not silence. The Albedo Brave was never silent. No Venator-class ship was. The engines produced a constant low register that you stopped hearing after the first week and started hearing again only when something changed about it. The quiet that was wrong was a different kind. It was the quiet of a ship where people had stopped moving between places. Cal noticed it before he understood it. He was awake, had been awake for perhaps 4 minutes, lying in his bunk with the specific, alert stillness of someone whose body had decided to surface before their mind caught up with why. The corridor outside his quarters was empty in a way corridors were not usually empty at this hour. Not the emptiness of a corridor with nobody in it. The emptiness of a corridor where the people who should be in it had stopped. He sat up. The ship's hum had changed register. He'd felt it in the last moment before sleep, and he felt it now more clearly, as something that had no name in his experience. A shift in the engines that wasn't a deceleration, wasn't a course adjustment, wasn't any of the normal transit variations he'd catalogued over 3 months aboard. It was something else. Something the ship was doing that it hadn't been doing before. He reached for his boots. He was halfway through lacing the second one when he felt it in the force. Not clearly. Not the way he would be able to describe it later, because later he would have words for things he didn't have words for yet. What he felt was something he would spend years trying to name, and eventually stop trying to name. Because the closest he ever got was wrong. A sense that something in the living texture of the ship, the presence of everyone aboard it, had shifted in a way that had no precedent in anything he'd learned to read. It was like a sound cutting off in the middle of a note. He stood up. His door opened before he reached it. Jaro T'Pol was in the corridor. He was already in motion, not running. T'Pol did not run, but moving with the compressed efficiency of a large man who had decided that every step had a destination, and no step was wasted. His lightsaber was in his hand, not ignited, in his hand. The distinction mattered. because Tapple did not hold his lightsaber without reason, had never in 14 months done anything without reason. His eyes found Cal immediately. He said one word, "Come." Not "what's happening," not "we need to move," not any of the explanatory language that a moment this large seemed to require. Just the word that closed the distance between where Cal was and where T'Pol needed him to be. Cal came. They moved down the corridor toward the junction at the ship's midsection, and the corridor was wrong in the way Cal had felt without seeing. Too empty, too quiet, the specific texture of a space that had recently held people who were no longer in it. 2 doors they passed were sealed from the inside. A maintenance cart had been abandoned midway through its route, its cleaning arm extended, its sensor light blinking in the patient confusion of a machine, waiting for an operator who wasn't coming back. At the junction, they stopped. T'Pol held up one hand, the gesture that meant be still, be quiet, process. Cal processed. Down the left corridor, voices. Clone voices. The flat, identical timbre of identical vocal configurations, which Cal had learned to individuate over 3 months by rhythm and habit and context. But right now, he couldn't individuate anything, because what the voices were saying was arriving too fast and too wrong for his mind to pass it as normal. They were not the voices of soldiers on patrol. They were not the voices of soldiers running a drill. They were something else. Purposeful in a way that purpose was not supposed to sound. Down the right corridor, the sound of something falling. Then stillness. Then the sound of boots. 3 sets, evenly paced, moving away. Tapple's hand closed around Cal's arm. Not harshly, not panicked, but with the specific grip of someone communicating through their hand what they cannot take the time to communicate with words. "I have you. Stay with me. Stay close." Cal looked up at his master's face. Tapple was not afraid. This was the most frightening thing in the corridor. Not the sounds, not the sealed doors, not the abandoned maintenance cart. The fact that Jaro T'Pol, who Cal had seen in combat, in difficult briefings, in the moments after missions that had not gone correctly, was not afraid. He was something else. He was the specific version of himself that existed beyond fear, which Cal recognized without being able to name, which meant whatever was happening was large enough that fear was not the appropriate response anymore. They moved right. Cal would remember the next 8 minutes in fragments. Not because his memory failed. His memory would prove, in the years that followed, to be precise and merciless about this particular window of time. But because 8 minutes of the thing that was happening was not 8 minutes of connected narrative. It was 8 minutes of corridor and decision and motion, each second independent of the last. The way a series of still images is not quite the same as movement even when placed in sequence. He remembered. A doorway where T'Pol stopped them and waited for 20 seconds while boots moved past on the other side, close enough that the sound came through the wall at a frequency Cal felt in his sternum rather than heard with his ears. He remembered a viewport they passed at speed, and the outside of the ship visible through it for approximately 1 second. And what was outside the ship were not the stars he had fallen asleep looking at. There were other ships, gunships, moving in patterns that were not transit patterns. He remembered a face. This is the one he could not file away, or compress, or set at a workable distance. At the junction near the engineering section, 3 clones came around the corner, heading toward them, and in the fraction of a second before Tapple moved, before the corridor became the kind of corridor it was about to become, Cal saw the face of the one in the center. He knew that face, not the name, He had never learned the name, but the face, he'd seen it across the mess hall every morning for 3 months. He'd seen it in the equipment bay, running diagnostics with the careful attention of someone who did careful work. He'd seen it nod at him once, in the specific way soldiers nodded at Jedi Padawans. Not quite a salute, not quite a greeting, something between them that acknowledged, "You're on my ship. We are not the same. But we are on the same side." That face was behind the rifle now. The rifle was already rising. There was no hesitation in it. That was the thing Cal's mind snagged on and could not release. There was no hesitation. No recognition of who was in the corridor. No moment where the face behind the rifle processed, "I know this person." The rifle rose with the smooth mechanical certainty of a reflex. And behind the eyes of the clone Cal had nodded to across a mess hall every morning for 3 months was something that was not the person Cal had been nodding at. Or it was. That was the worst possibility. That it was exactly the same person. That nothing had been replaced or altered in any way that the person themselves could feel. And this was simply what had always been inside them, waiting. Tapple's lightsaber ignited. The corridor became something else. Cal ran. T'Pol moved behind him and ahead of him and beside him in ways that seemed to violate what one person's body could occupy. Because a Jedi Master who has decided that a Padawan is going to survive, this is not entirely governed by geometry. He deflected what came at them. He cleared what was in front of them. He did not engage beyond what was necessary to keep them moving, which was itself a discipline Cal understood only in retrospect. That stopping to fight would have meant stopping, and stopping was not survivable. The sounds of the corridor during those 8 minutes, blaster fire, which was a sound Cal knew from 3 years of a war that had been the background of his adolescence, but not from this angle, not from the angle of being the target. The impact of shots against walls and flooring, which left scorching, and the acrid smell of superheated metal. T'Pol's lightsaber, the specific register of a dual-blade saber that Cal had heard in practice hundreds of times and had never once heard used in this way, at this speed, for this purpose. And underneath all of it, the ship's engines, still running their changed register, indifferent to everything happening in the corridors below, continuing to carry all of them, the living, the dead, and what was about to become each, through deep space toward a destination nobody aboard had chosen. The storage compartment was at the end of a maintenance junction on level 2. It was not large, 3 meters by 2, shelving on 2 walls, a climate-controlled section for sensitive equipment that had nothing sensitive in it at the moment. The door sealed with a manual locking mechanism and a secondary magnetic clamp, the kind of redundant security that military vessels put on compartments that held things worth protecting. T'Pol opened it, looked at Cal. Cal understood. He understood the way you understand things, in the moments when understanding and acting have to happen at the same time, when there is no space between comprehension and response. He understood that he was going into the compartment. He understood that T'Pol was not coming in. He understood that the thing T'Pol was about to do on the other side of the door was something he was going to do alone. And he understood why. And the why was the part of the understanding that his mind refused to hold in full. "Master." T'Pol put one hand on the side of Cal's face, briefly, a gesture that contained everything that the next 30 seconds didn't have room for. Then he said something that Cal would spend years trying to remember exactly. Something about the Force, something about patience not being the same as waiting, not the same words as the corridor, not the exact same sentence, something adjacent to it, something that rhymed with it in a way that language didn't have a term for. Then, wait. Do not reach for me. Whatever you hear, wait. Cal went in. The door sealed. The magnetic clamp engaged with a sound like something final. Darkness. Not complete. There was a strip of emergency lighting along the floor. Dim orange, the kind of light that exists to tell you where the floor is, and nothing else. Cal could see his own hands. He could see the shelving. He could see the door, which was sealed, which was 3 centimeters of reinforced hull material between him and whatever was happening in the corridor beyond it. He could hear, not words, not anything decodable. The sounds that came through the door were processed by the door into something shapeless, muffled impacts, vibrations that arrived through the floor rather than through air. The occasional modulation of something he recognized as a lightsaber and then did not recognize as anything, because the pattern of it changed in ways his training had no framework for. He stood with his back against the far wall and his hands at his sides, and he did not reach. T'Pol had said, "Do not reach for me." Cal knew what this meant. He had enough training to know that reaching, extending his force sense toward his master, would tell him things. Things about what was happening. Things about how bad the cost of whatever T'Pol was doing out there was running. And T'Pol had told him not to, because T'Pol understood something Cal was still learning, that knowing sometimes made you worse at the thing you needed to do next. That the information available to you in a moment of maximum fear was not always information you could use. He didn't reach. He stood in the emergency lighting and breathed in, slowly, out. The ship vibrated around him, not the engines now, something else. Impacts against the hull from outside. The distant concussive shuddering of a vessel taking damage. The floor shifted once, slightly. The shelving rattled. He counted the emergency lights. There were 4. He counted them again. 4. He thought about the corridor, about the 12 seconds, about the way the 3 crates had felt when he stopped reaching for them and simply let the space include them. He tried to let the space include him. He could not. He was 13 and alone in the dark, and the sounds coming through the door were changing in a way that was not improvement. And the force, which had been almost clear to him this morning, almost something he could hold without grasping, was not available to him right now. Or it was available, and he was too frightened to find it, which amounted to the same thing. He waited. This was the first patience he had ever practiced that was not practice. On a transport vessel in a different sector of the same sky, the communication came through as fragments, not a transmission, not a formal channel. Something else, a partial signal, the kind that arrives when someone is trying to reach a receiver, and most of the path between sender and receiver has already been destroyed. It lasted 11 seconds. It contained a voice, barely identifiable as a voice under the interference, saying something that became coherent only in its last 3 words before the signal cut. Siri heard those 3 words. She put down her stylus. She looked at the datapad for a moment, with the expression of someone who has received information that cannot be processed in the space of one expression, and is taking what time is available, which was very little, to let it arrive. Then she stood up, crossed the hold in 4 steps, and crouched beside the equipment bench along the port wall. She pulled out the lower storage panel with the specific movement of someone who already knew it could move, who had noted it as a possibility, who had filed it under contingency without expecting to open that file. Inside, a narrow space. Not comfortable, not designed for occupancy. Approximately 1 meter tall, 2 meters deep, accessible through the removed panel. She looked at Triller. Triller was already looking at her. She had heard the 3 words too. Siri said, "In." Not an explanation. not context. The same compression of everything that couldn't fit in the time available, delivered as a single word, which Trilla received the way she received everything from Siri, as something that carried more weight than its surface, as something that had been considered before it was said, even when it appeared unconsidered. Trilla moved. She was inside the space in seconds. She turned in the dark and looked back at Siri through the gap. Sira's face was not calm. The word calm implied the absence of something. What her face held was the presence of everything. Everything she understood about what the three words meant. Everything she understood about what was about to happen. Everything she understood about the odds of what she was about to go back and face. And the decision already made before her expression had time to finish forming about what mattered more than any of it. She said, "Do not make a sound. Do not reach for me. Wait." Then she slid the panel back. The dark was complete. The space was small. The sounds from outside it, the ship's normal transit sounds, and then, gradually, other sounds that were not transit sounds arrived through the walls as vibrations that Trilla's body processed before her mind did, the way threat arrives when you have been trained to receive it. In the spine first, in the thinking second. She pressed herself against the back of the space. She breathed. She did not reach for her master. She held to the last thing she'd seen. Siri's face in the moment before the panel closed, which she had been reading for over a year, and which she read now the way you read something you need to have exactly right, as the face of someone who has already accepted something enormous and is not going to let that acceptance become hesitation. Outside the panel, sounds, then voices, then for a long moment, something Trilla could not interpret, something that was too close and too specific and too frightening to hold as abstraction, and then a silence that was different from the silences that had come before it. She stayed. 2 compartments, 2 ships, 2 girls who had been placed in the dark by the people who had decided that their survival was worth whatever the decision cost. They did not know about each other. They would not know about each other for a long time. But in the specifics of what they were doing, the breathing, the waiting, the choosing not to reach even though reaching was available, even though not reaching felt like the hardest thing, they were doing exactly the same thing, in the same hour, in the same sky. The force which moved through all living things and did not distinguish between ships or sectors, she held both of them in the same moment. If either of them had reached, if they had broken the instruction and extended their sense outward, they might have felt the other. A flicker, another Padawan, another darkness, another girl doing the same thing in a different compartment, in a different hall, in the same terrible hour. They didn't reach. They had been told not to. They were both, in their different ways, the kind of students who did what their masters told them when their masters used that particular tone. This would matter. Much later, in ways neither of them could have predicted from inside the dark of a sealed compartment, this would matter enormously. At 1:43 ship time, the Albedo Brave logged an unauthorized discharge of weapons in sections 3 through 7 of its middle decks. This log entry was automatically transmitted to Republic Command. Republic Command received 47,000 similar transmissions in the same 90-second window. The processing system that handled incoming military transmissions flagged them all as high priority and placed them in a queue for review. No review was ever conducted. The review system was controlled by a republic that had ceased to exist at 1:38. Though the announcement would not be made for another 6 hours, and the paperwork formalizing what had already happened would take 3 days, and the galaxy would take years, decades, to understand the full shape of what had been done to it in those 90 seconds. Inside the compartment on the Albedo Brave, Cal Kestis sat on the floor, not because he had decided to sit, because his legs had made the decision for him at some point in the last several minutes. A quiet retreat from the vertical that his body had apparently required without consulting him. He was sitting with his back against the far wall, his knees pulled up, his hands pressed flat against the floor on either side of him. The sounds through the door had changed again. He didn't know what the change meant. He had been trying for the past several minutes to find a way to interpret what was happening by sound alone, to build a picture of the corridor from vibration and muffled report and the specific frequencies of impacts. And he had failed because there was no vocabulary in his experience for what the sounds were describing. He pressed his hands harder against the floor. The floor was cold, duraplast and structural plating. She cool to the touch in the way that metal is always cool, indifferent to the temperature of the body pressed against it. He focused on the cold. He focused on the 4 emergency lights. He focused on his breathing, which was too fast, and which he was attempting to slow by the same technique T'Pol had shown him for focus exercises, which was simply to notice that it was fast without judging the fact, and then breathe as if you'd already decided to be slower. He was 13. He was in the dark. He was waiting for something to tell him what had happened, and nothing was telling him. And the Force was somewhere. It was always somewhere. He was not so frightened that he couldn't feel its presence at the edges of the room, the way you can feel the warmth of something outside a closed window. But it was not giving him the thing he wanted, which was information, which was clarity, which was the knowledge of whether his master was still in the corridor or had moved somewhere else, or... He stopped that thought. He pressed his hands against the cold floor. He breathed. In, slowly, out. The order that was transmitted at 1:43 was not long. It was not complex. It did not explain itself, because orders of that kind never explain themselves. Explanation implies the possibility of debate, and this was not a thing designed to be debated. It was transmitted on a frequency that had no civilian equivalent, carried in a channel that had no address in the Republic's standard communication architecture, received not by comlinks or datalinks, but by the neural architecture of 66,000 soldiers who had been built from before birth to receive it. The soldiers did not know it was coming. They also did not know it wasn't. Whether those two things are the same is a question that was never answered to anyone's satisfaction, and may not be answerable, and the script does not try. What the script knows is this. In the compartment on the Albedo Brave, a boy was breathing in the dark. In a storage space on a transport 3 sectors away, a girl was doing the same. And in all the space between them, all the cold, indifferent, unrecording space of a galaxy that was continuing without pause. Something that had existed for 25,000 years was ending. It did not end dramatically. It did not announce itself. It went the way most things go when the time has been carefully arranged, quietly and quickly, and before anyone had finished understanding that it was happening. It was already over, they just didn't know yet. There is a particular kind of memory that does not behave like other memories. Most memories soften with time. The edges round, the colors flatten. The emotional weight of a moment decreases incrementally with each passing year, until what remains is more like a drawing of the thing than the thing itself. Recognizable, reduced, manageable. This is what memory does for most people with most experiences, and it is a mercy and it is how people continue. The memories Cal Kestis carried from the Albedo Brave did not soften. They remained precisely themselves. Not because he was exceptional, not because of anything particular about his nature or his training, but because they were the last memories of a world that no longer existed. And the mind does not soften the last clear image of something it cannot replace. It keeps it exactly the way you keep the last letter from someone who is gone, not framed, not displayed, just kept, somewhere you know about, somewhere you can find it if you need to, and avoid it when you cannot afford to need it. He would spend 5 years on Braca not thinking about Jaro Tapal. This is not the same as forgetting. He understood the difference by the time he was 15, which is earlier than most people learn it. Not thinking about something and not being able to think about something are different disciplines with different costs. He practiced the first. He was unable to practice the second because the material kept finding ways in, through the specific weight of a tool in his hand, through the sound of boots in a corridor, through the 30 seconds after a shift ended when there was nothing to do and the silence arrived before he was ready for it. The material found its way in, and when it did, what it found its way back to was never the corridor, never the last minutes. It found its way to the ordinary things, the things that had happened before any of it became what it became, the things so unremarkable at the time that he had not known to record them carefully. He had not known he would need them so badly. Jaro Tapal had chosen Cal from the initiate halls when Cal was 9 years old. Cal did not know why. He had been one of 37 initiates in his cohort, most of them more advanced in at least one area of study, several of them more naturally gifted in force sensitivity as the temple measured such things. He had not stood out in any particular way that he could identify. He had been himself, attentive, occasionally frustrated, better at the practical than the theoretical, which his instructors noted without judgment, and Tapal had apparently decided was sufficient. The day of the selection, Tapal had walked into the initiate training room during a standard exercise and stood at the edge of the space and watched for approximately 4 minutes. Then he had crossed the room and stopped in front of Cal and said, "You, come with me." Not a question. Cal had looked at his cohort instructor, who had nodded with the expression of someone who had been through this before and found it unremarkable. He had gone. He asked in the corridor why. Tapal had looked down at him. The height difference was significant. She would always be significant, and said, "You were the only one in the room listening to the exercise instead of performing it." Cal had thought about this for several days. He was not entirely sure it was a compliment. He eventually decided it was something more useful than a compliment, which was an observation, a piece of information about himself, accurate, offered without inflation or diminishment. He decided, 9 years old, and beginning the recalibration that living with Jaro Tapal would require, that he could work with an observation. Tapal was not a warm man. This needs to be stated plainly, because the warmth was real. It was simply not the kind that announced itself. It was the kind that you noticed only after you had been in proximity to it, long enough for the cumulative effect to become unmistakable. The way old stone, as pressed against long enough, gives back the heat it has been holding all along. He did not praise frequently. When he praised, it was specific. Not well done, but the second movement was cleaner than yesterday. You've resolved the tension in your left shoulder, which meant more than general approval because it proved he had been watching, which proved the work was worth watching. Cal learned to prefer specific correction to general praise for the same reason. If you were being specific, you were being honest. If you were being honest, the information was useful. He had a habit of going still when he was thinking. Not the performed stillness of meditation, real stillness. The kind that came from not needing to perform anything for the people around him. He could stand in a doorway for 30 seconds, looking at something across the room. And the 30 seconds did not feel uncomfortable to be near. They felt like being near something that had enough mass to create its own gravity. You stayed in orbit without being asked to. Cal had spent 14 months learning the difference between the silences. The silence that meant wait, I am considering how to explain this. The silence that meant you already know the answer, find it. The silence that meant this is not a moment for words, be still with me. That last one came after training sessions. It was not a formal practice. It had no name in the Jedi text Cal had read. It had emerged between them the way a habit emerges, through repetition without intention, through the fact of two people consistently doing the same thing in the same space, until the thing became the space. After every session, before the debrief or the next assignment or whatever the ship's schedule demanded, there was a period of stillness, 2 minutes, sometimes 5, sometimes less when the schedule was tight. They stood in whatever space they'd been using, corridor, training room, empty cargo bay, and they let the work settle. Cal had asked about it once. He'd been 12, recently aware that things he'd been doing naturally might have names, interested in cataloguing them properly. Tapple had looked at him with something that was not quite humour. It lived near humour. It had humour as a neighbour. Some things don't need names to be worth doing, he'd said. And then he'd returned to the stillness, which meant the conversation was finished, which meant Cal filed it where he filed things T'Pol said that he didn't fully understand yet, somewhere accessible, seeker, for later. He had never returned to it in the way he'd intended. Later had been rescheduled indefinitely by events on the Albedo Brave. The compartment door opened at 3:11 ship time, not by Tapple's hand. The Albedo Brave had been taking external fire for the past hour, not from enemies, which was the particular cruelty of this specific chaos, but from Republic-aligned vessels whose crews had received the same order that the 13th Battalion had received, and were responding to the Venators' erratic behavior with the assumption that something aboard had gone wrong with the ship's allegiance. They were not wrong, precisely. They were wrong in the specific direction of the error, which was that the ship's allegiance had not changed, only the allegiance of the soldiers running it. The structural damage from the external fire reached level 2 at 0309. A power conduit in the maintenance junction shorted, cascaded into the secondary systems that controlled the compartment locks in sections 7 through 12, and the magnetic clamps released in sequence. Methodically, the way machines fail when they fail, along a single point of dependency, completely and in order. The door of Cal's compartment unsealed with a sound that was less dramatic than it should have been. A click, the hiss of pressure equilibrating, the door swinging inward on its hinge because the ship had listed 3 degrees to port and gravity was doing the rest. Cal did not move immediately. He had been sitting on the floor for approximately 90 minutes. He had, at some point in the second half of that period, had run out of things to do with his mind and had arrived at a state that was not quite meditation and not quite paralysis. Something between them, the default of a mind that had exhausted its available strategies and settled into the pure fact of existing in a sealed space, breathing, waiting. The door was open. He stood up. His legs were stiff. He steadied himself against the shelving, because the ship's list made the floor untrustworthy in small ways that added up. He looked at the open door. Beyond it, the maintenance junction. Empty. The emergency lighting, the same orange strip running along the floor in both directions. He stepped through. The Albedo Brave in the minutes after was a different ship than the Albedo Brave of before. Not destroyed, not yet. Damaged. Listing. You are the kind of wounded that a large ship carries for a while, before the damage resolves one way or another. The corridors were the same corridors, the same width, the same markings on the walls, the same conduit housings and ventilation grills and viewport placements. The physical ship was continuous with the ship Cal had moved through for 3 months. Everything else had changed. The specific change was absence. Not wreckage, absence. The corridors were empty in a way that corridors were not designed to be, and the emptiness was not peaceful. It had a texture, the texture of a space where things had happened and were no longer happening, where the people who had been present had either moved elsewhere or were no longer present in any way that mattered. Cal moved through it. He did not look for what he did not want to find. He knew, somewhere beneath conscious decision, that looking would produce findings that were not currently survivable. He moved with the specific purposefulness of someone who has identified a task, to Pal's quarters, level 1, forward section, and is using the task as the structure that keeps them moving, when moving requires more than they have. He passed the junction near the engineering section. He did not look at what was there. He continued. What Cal carried out of Jaro Tapal's quarters was not many things. The quarters were small. Officers' quarters on a Venator were not designed to hold a life. They were designed to hold the operational minimum of a person. There was not much to take. Cal stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the desk, the charging cradle with the comlink in it, but the datapad still open to the report Tapal had been reading. The cursor blinking in the patient and terrible way that machines continue to be ready for operators who are no longer available. He looked at the shelf. The sealed case was exactly where it had always been. He crossed the room. He picked it up. He held it for a moment. It was heavier than it looked, or it felt heavier than it had looked when Tapal held it, which might have been the same thing, or might have been a function of who was holding it now. He did not open it. He would open it twice in the next 5 years, and both times would close it quickly, not because what was inside was painful to look at, but because what was inside was unchanged, and unchanged things in a world that had changed completely had a specific quality that was difficult to be near for long. He put it under his arm. He left. But the chapter is not about the leaving. The chapter is about what was built before the leaving, and what it cost to build it, and those two things require going back. One more time, into the corridor, into the 90 minutes before the door opened. Because there was a moment. Inside the compartment, after the sounds through the door had reached a certain point, and then changed, and then stopped in a way that was different from the silence between sounds, a way that was not pause, but completion. Cal had felt it, not clearly, not the way he would someday be able to feel such things when 5 more years of survival had sharpened what the Order had begun to develop, but clearly enough. The force, which he had been unable to reach for in the first 30 minutes of his isolation, had become present, in a different way, in the last 10. Not offering information, not reaching toward him, simply present, the way it was present in the aftermath of something significant, as if the living force, which connected all things, had noted a change in what it was connecting, and had settled into the new configuration without commentary. Cal had understood what the presence meant. He had understood it the way you understand something you cannot afford to understand completely. At the edges, at the margins, enough to know and not enough to collapse under knowing. He had made a choice. He had not reached. Not because he couldn't, because Tapple had said, "Do not reach for me." And because Cal was, at the foundation of everything, the kind of student who listened. And because somewhere beneath the following of the instruction, beneath the trust in the person who had given it, was a piece of understanding that was new and true and cost everything it cost, that knowing would not change what had happened, and that not knowing was the last gift he could give his master, the clean separation, the refusal to make Tapple's ending about Cal's need for information. He had sat in the dark. He had breathed. He had not reached. And in that not reaching, in that specific act of staying within the boundary of what he had been told, in the worst moment he had yet survived, he had done, for the first time without being guided, the thing T'Pol had spent 14 months teaching him. He had met the Force rather than chasing it. He had been patient in a way that was not waiting. He had let something be exactly what it was without reaching to change it, without the grasping that makes grief louder instead of quieter. T'Pol had taught him that. In 14 months of corridors and borrowed training spaces and shared silences after sessions that had no name, T'Pol had built something in Cal Kestis that Cal had not known was being built. That is the nature of the best building. It happens below the level of the person it is happening to, and they only discover what was built when they are required to use it, usually in conditions that are not ideal. The conditions had not been ideal. The building had held. Cal emerged from the Albedo Brave on an escape pod that automated systems launched when hull integrity dropped below 30%. He had not chosen the launch. He had simply been in the pod when it happened, which was either survival instinct or the Force placing him where the exit was. And at 13, he did not have the philosophical equipment to distinguish between those two things, and simply accepted that he was alive and moving, and that the ship he'd been on was receding in the viewport. He looked at it for a moment. The Albedo Brave, still large, still structurally present, already becoming something that would be processed and repurposed by whatever logistics came next, in a galaxy that was rearranging itself around an event he still barely understood. He looked until he couldn't see it anymore. Then he looked at the sealed case in his lap. He didn't open it. He held it the way you hold things that are not yours anymore and not quite yours to give away. Things that exist in the between space of belonging to someone who is no longer there to receive them. Things from before, worth keeping. He held it. The escape pod moved through the dark. Outside, the war that had ended and the occupation that had begun were indistinguishable from each other at this distance, which was the first and most important thing Cal Kestis would learn about the world he was now living in. They were not distinguishable from a distance. You had to be very close and very still, and you had to be the kind of person who listened to the room instead of performing for it, to understand the difference. He was that kind of person. A dead man had spent 14 months making sure of it. What happened in the corridor of Level 3 between 143 and 309 was not recorded by either side. The Albedo Brave's internal security system logged a systems failure at 144 that corrupted the deck-level surveillance archive for sections 3 through 9. The Imperial records that would later catalogue Order 66 casualties on Venator-class vessels list Jedi Master Jaro T'Pol under the designation Confirmed Neutralized Outer Rim Theater, cause unspecified. Unspecified. The script knows what it cost. The script will not call it by a bureaucratic name. The record was lost. This is the only entry in the script that says so directly. It says it here in this chapter about this man, because if it is said only once, it should be said about him. The thing about carrying something for a long time is that you stop noticing the weight. Not because the weight decreases. It doesn't decrease. It stays exactly what it is, which is the nature of certain kinds of weight. They do not respond to time the way physical loads respond to time. Do not fatigue the muscles and force you to set them down. They simply become part of the load distribution, part of how you stand, part of the specific angle at which your shoulders sit when you are not thinking about your shoulders, which is most of the time, which means the weight is most of the time invisible, even to the person carrying it. Siri had been carrying the same weight for 5 years. She had become very good at standing in a way that didn't show it. This is not a skill anyone teaches. It develops the way scar tissue develops, through the body's insistence on continuing despite damage, through the slow replacement of injured material with something less flexible and more durable, something that does the job but does it differently than what was there before. You don't choose it. You simply find, one day, that you have it, that you are capable of standing in a room and looking completely functional, and feeling, somewhere beneath the functionality, the precise and undiminished weight of the thing you have been carrying since the day it became yours to carry. She had been carrying it since a transport vessel, in a sector she no longer visited, in the month the Empire called Vigilus and the survivors called the beginning of After. Before the weight, there was Triller. It's not Triller the Inquisitor. That comes later, and the chapter will not arrive there without earning it. Before everything that was made of Triller, there was the girl herself, 11 years old when Siri first encountered her on a routine posting that should have been unremarkable and turned out to be the kind of unremarkable that rearranges things. Siri had not been looking for a Padawan. She was a knight, not a master. The distinction mattered in the temple's formal architecture, which required a certain demonstration of readiness before the assignment of a student. She had not made that demonstration. She had not particularly been working toward it. She had been working toward the next mission, and the one after that, and the steady accumulation of service that was her relationship with the Order. Practical, committed, not sentimental. And then there was this girl. What Siri saw in Triller was not exceptional force sensitivity, though that was present. It was not outstanding technical skill, though that was developing. What she saw was something harder to quantify, and more important than either, a mind that moved laterally. That found the unexpected connection between two things that nobody had thought to place beside each other. That argued with received wisdom, not out of defiance, but out of genuine interrogation, the kind that required the wisdom to actually answer, rather than simply reassert itself. Siri found this interesting. She found it interesting in the way that people find interesting. The thing that reflects something in themselves they hadn't fully examined, recognizing, in someone else's quality, the shape of a thing they'd always had but never named. The arrangement formalized itself over a year of proximity. No announcement, no ceremony. One day they were knight and Padawan, in the sense that the temple recognized, and the texture of how they worked together was already so established by then that the formalization changed nothing except the paperwork. Triller argued about texts. This is where to start, because it is the most specific and therefore the most true thing about what they were together. Triller read everything she could get access to and formed opinions about it before she had finished reading, which meant her opinions were sometimes wrong in the specific way that opinions formed from incomplete information are wrong. Not randomly, not stupidly, but in a direction that was entirely consistent with the piece she'd read, and entirely inconsistent with the piece she hadn't reached yet. Siri found this useful. She had developed a practice of giving Triller texts in fragments, not as a pedagogical strategy, not deliberately, but because the ship they were on had limited library access, and texts arrived in sections as bandwidth allowed. Triller would read what arrived and argue with it. Then the next section would arrive, and Triller would go quiet for a few minutes, and then, usually without acknowledgement, adjust her position to accommodate the new information. She never said, "I was wrong." She simply incorporated and continued, which Siri eventually recognized as a more sophisticated response than the explicit admission, the ability to update without requiring the update to be witnessed. "You're doing it again," Siri said once, watching Triller's expression during a text session. "Doing what?" "Deciding you were right before you finished reading." "I might be right. You might." A pause. "What does the next section say?" Triller read it. Her expression shifted in the microscopic way it shifted when information arrived that required the previous position to be reconsidered. She said nothing. She read the section after that. "Okay," she said eventually. "Okay. The original argument has a structural problem I didn't account for." "Yes, but the conclusion it reaches is still valid." Siri thought about this. "Show me how." Triller showed her. She was right. The conclusion held even with the structural problem acknowledged. Siri noted this in the margin of her own copy, with 2 words, "Triller correct." And Triller never saw the notation, and the notation remained, in a datapad that no longer existed, as evidence of something that also no longer existed, except in the specific and undiminished way that it existed in Siri's memory. They disagreed about the Force, not about its reality or its nature. On those foundations, they agreed without discussion. They disagreed about its direction, about whether the Force was primarily something you moved through or something that moved through you. Siri held the first position, that Force sensitivity was an instrument, a capacity, something a trained mind brought to bear on the world with intention. Triller held the second, somewhat loosely, in the way that 11-year-olds hold philosophical positions, genuinely, but without having fully stress-tested them against the full weight of experience. "If you're moving through it," Triller said during one of these disagreements, "somewhere between Ord Mantell and their next posting, then you're treating it like a river, like something external." "That's not what I said. That's what the position implies. The position implies that the practitioner has agency. The practitioner has agency in both versions." Triller was cross-legged on the equipment bench. She did this when she was thinking hard, reduced her contact with the floor somehow, as if physical stability was a resource she was temporarily reallocating to cognitive effort. "In mine, the agency is about what you listen for. In yours, it's about what you do. Those aren't the same." Siri had said nothing for a moment. "No," she'd said. "They're not." She had not conceded the argument. She had simply acknowledged the distinction, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The recognition that the other person had found something real, even if you were not ready to fully renegotiate your position around it. She thought about that conversation later. She thought about it specifically in the years after, when her connection to the Force was something she carried access to but did not use, a door she had locked from the inside because the alternative was to open it and feel everything it wanted to show her, which was too much, which was not survivable in the condition she was in. She thought about it because Triller had been right. The agency for Siri in those years was about what she chose not to listen for, about the things she actively declined to receive. This was a form of force use, even in the refusal. The force was still there. She was simply choosing, very deliberately, not to let it move through her, because what it wanted to show her was Triller, and Triller was not something she could look at yet. The Empire found Siri 6 weeks after Order 66. They found her because she was not particularly hiding. This sounds like a failure of instinct, and is not. It is the result of a calculation made in the first hours after the transport incident, which was the following. She was known. She had a record. She had operated in too many theaters, interacted with too many Republic contacts, appeared in too many mission logs. The Empire had inherited the Republic's entire administrative infrastructure, which meant it had inherited every record the Republic had kept, which meant it had her file, her face, and a list of her last known locations. She was not going to outrun that. She had considered running anyway, because the alternative was what the alternative was. But running would have consumed the energy that hiding Triller had bought, and she was not ready to waste that purchase on a flight that ended in the same place. So she had continued, made herself findable in the specific way that someone makes themselves findable when they want control over the conditions of the finding. She moved in predictable patterns, stayed in places connected to her previous postings, was visible enough that when they came without the heightened preparation they would have brought to a cornered fugitive. They came in the month of Vigilus, in a place she will not name, because naming it makes it a location. And she has spent 5 years refusing to let it become a location in her mind. It is simply the place where the finding happened. It has no other identity. What happened there, the chapter will not detail. Not because it is unspeakable. Some things are speakable and still wrong to speak. Not because the details are unavailable. She knows the details with the precision that the body retains things done to it, the body being a more accurate record keeper than any archive. But because the chapter is not about what they did, it is about what it left. What it left was a break, specific, located. The way a bone breaks at the point of maximum stress, not randomly, but at the exact place the structure was most vulnerable. In Siri's case, the break was in the connection between herself and the Force, not severed by the Empire, not taken from her, but closed by her own hand in the moment when continuing to feel it meant feeling Triller's location through it. The moment when she understood that she could give them Triller and stop what was happening, or she could close the door on everything the Force was showing her and give them nothing. She closed the door. They got nothing. They got nothing, and Triller was safe, and the compartment on the transport had held, and for a window of time that Siri measured in weeks rather than months or years, she believed this. She held it. She continued into the after on the foundation of it, that the closing of the door had meant something, had purchased something, and had at minimum kept one person alive who would otherwise not be alive. And then the Empire found Triller anyway, through a different channel, through someone else's failure, or someone else's record, or the simple, relentless arithmetic of an apparatus designed specifically to find people who were hiding. They found her through means that had nothing to do with Siri, and everything to do with the fact that the Empire had more time and more resources than any individual it was looking for. They found Triller, and they made her into something else. Siri learned this the way you learn things you were hoping not to learn. Gradually, through fragments, through the specific intelligence networks that surviving Jedi maintained, not because the networks were good, but because no network was better. She learned it in pieces, over months, and each piece requiring her to revise the previous version of the truth she'd been carrying. The version where the door had purchased something. The version where the cost had been worth it. The revision process took a long time. It produced something that was not resolution. There is no resolution available for this specific sequence of events. The version of resolution that movies and stories offer, where understanding arrives and the weight decreases, was not available to Siri Junda because understanding was available and the weight did not decrease. It remained exactly itself. She simply learned to stand in a way that didn't show it. This is not the same as healing. She did not mistake it for healing. It is the thing that happens when healing is not available and stopping is not an option. It has no heroic name. It is simply what continuing looks like from the inside, which is much less dignified and much more effortful than it appears from the outside. And the effort is constant, and the dignity is a performance you maintain, because the alternative is to stop performing it. And then you have to figure out what comes after that. She had not figured out what came after that. She had kept performing. The Stinger Mantis was not a beautiful ship. Siri had not chosen it for beauty. She had chosen it because it was available, and its pilot needed credits, and she needed transport. And the specific arithmetic of that transaction had produced an arrangement that had lasted longer than either party had originally anticipated. Grease Dritus was a Latero, small, four-armed, constitutionally suspicious of coincidence, professionally suspicious of Jedi. He had made his feelings about Jedi clear in the first conversation, in a way that Siri had found clarifying rather than offensive. He was not going to pretend enthusiasm he didn't feel. He was going to do the job and be honest about his reservations. She respected this. He was, underneath the reservations, someone who showed up. This was rarer than it sounded. In the years after Order 66, the quality that separated the people you could work with from the people you couldn't was not ideological alignment or skill set or even personal compatibility. It was the simple question of whether they showed up when the thing required showing up. Grease showed up. He complained while doing it, which Siri found she could accommodate. She had been on the Stinger Mantis for 4 months. She had spent those months doing the work of finding, not Jedi. She not yet, not directly, but the threads that led toward where Jedi might be, the networks, the whispers, the records that existed in the gaps between Imperial records, in the spaces where things had been removed rather than reported, which were themselves a kind of information if you knew how to read absence. She had been reading absence for 5 years. She had become very good at it. The datapad was on the fold-down table in the Mantis's common area. It had been on that table for 3 days, which was how long she had known what was on it and had been deciding what knowing it meant. A name, a location, a fragment of a report from a Scrapper Guild contact in the outer systems, the kind of report that arrived through 6 layers of untraceable relay and said very little and implied considerably more. The report said, Braca, salvage worker, Shah possible sensitivity, unconfirmed, no incident yet. The name on the report was Cal Kestis. She knew the name. Not well. She had not known the boy, had not known Jaro Tapal personally, had known of him in the way that knights knew of each other within the Order's operational structure. She knew that Tapal had a Padawan. She knew the Padawan's name. She knew from the same fragmentary intelligence that told her Trilla had become something else. that the Albedo Brave had been one of the Venators lost in the Order 66 window. She had assumed, as she had assumed about most names from that window, that the story was finished. The report said the story was not finished. She sat with this for 3 days, not because she was uncertain about the decision. The decision was obvious, which was its own kind of difficulty. Obvious decisions made from a place of damage had a quality that careful decisions made from a place of stability did not have. They moved faster. They used the urgency of the moment to override the slower considerations. And the slower considerations, in this case, were significant. She was not whole. She had a connection to the force that she had locked from the inside and had not reopened in 5 years. She had a student who was no longer her student in any way that the word applied, who was something she had contributed to creating, not deliberately, not without anguish, but contributed nonetheless. She was carrying the specific damage of someone who had made a choice under impossible conditions and had discovered that the choice, which had been made to protect someone, she had not ultimately protected them. She was not, in other words, a particularly stable foundation on which to build someone else's continuation. She knew this. She sat with the datapad for 3 days. On the 3rd day, she picked it up. She told Grease that evening. Not everything. Enough. She told him the name, the location, the nature of what she was asking him to do, which was to take the Stinger Mantis to Braca and find a boy who had been hiding for 5 years and bring him into a situation that was not safe, had never been safe, and could not be made safe with available resources. Grease had looked at her for a long moment. "Is this the plan?" he said. "This specific thing I just heard. This is the plan. This is the beginning of the plan. That's not the same as having a plan." "No," Siri said. It's not." He had said nothing for a while. He had done the thing he did when processing information he found professionally objectionable. A slow rotation of his lower left hand, not quite a gesture, more of a processing tick. Then he had stood up and gone to the cockpit and begun the pre-jump calculations for Braca. He had not said yes. He had simply started preparing to go. She had sat in the common area with the datapad. Cal Kestis. Braca. Alive. She held the information the way you hold something that has been fragile in transit and has arrived intact against expectation. Carefully, with an awareness of its weight. With the specific attention of someone who knows that the thing in their hands has been carefully preserved by someone else for a very long time, and is now, finally, theirs to carry forward. She thought about the transport, about the storage panel along the port wall, pulled open, a space that was not designed for occupancy but was sufficient, about Trilla's face in the moment before the panel closed. The same gesture, different ship, different girl. She had put one student in the dark to save her, and it had not saved her. She was going to Braca to find another. She was going anyway. This was not a plan. It was not a redemption. It was not the beginning of a story that would end cleanly with the weight distributed differently. It was simply what continuing looked like. From the inside, on the 3rd day of sitting with a datapad, and understanding that the only thing worse than going was not going. She held the name. She held it carefully. Outside the viewport, hyperspace ran its white-blue constant, revealing nothing, just carrying everything forward. Braca was waiting. And on Braca, a boy who had been hiding for 5 years was working a shift on the bones of the war that had made him, not knowing that someone was coming, not knowing that the silence he had been practicing for 5 years was about to end. He would not choose for it to end. it would end anyway. That was the thing about silence Siri had learned. You could maintain it as long as nothing outside it required otherwise. And then something outside it required otherwise, and then you moved. Braca smelled like the end of things, not dramatically, not the way destroyed places smell in stories, not smoke and char and the romance of ruin. It smelled like metal that had been rained on too many times and never dried completely, like lubricant oxidizing in open air, like the specific staleness of enclosed spaces that had been sealed for years and then cut open, the stale breath of ships that had outlived everyone who had ever breathed inside them. Cal Kestis had been breathing this smell for 5 years. He no longer noticed it. This was the first and most important thing that 5 years of Braca had done to him. It had made the extraordinary ordinary, which was the only way to survive inside the extraordinary when leaving was not an option. The salvage yards were full of the wreckage of the Clone Wars, full of ships that had been something and were now material. Venator-class destroyers stripped to their superstructure, their corridors open to the sky like ribs. Y-wing fighters stacked in configurations their designers had not anticipated. Cruisers whose names were still partially legible on their hulls. Registry numbers, fleet designations, the bureaucratic identity of vessels that had carried people who were not here anymore. Cal moved through them every shift. He did not read the registry numbers. He had learned very early not to read the registry numbers. The Scrapper Guild issued its workers magnetic ascenders, a cutting tool rated for standard hull material, a respirator for enclosed work, and a ration card redeemable at 3 guild-approved vendors. The ration card bought food that was adequate. The tools were maintained by the workers themselves, which meant their quality varied according to the workers' diligence and the availability of maintenance supplies, which also varied. Cal maintained his tools carefully. This was not a statement about character. It was practical arithmetic. A cutting tool that failed during a shift cost time. Time lost cost credits. Credits were the only thing between him and the kind of visibility that came with having nothing, and visibility was the thing he could not afford. He had constructed his life on Braca around the architecture of not being visible. He moved at the same time every shift. He ate at the same vendor. He spoke to the same small number of people. He did not draw attention through excellence or failure. He maintained a performance level that was sufficient and unremarkable, filed his guild reports on time, and returned each day to the same bunk in the same workers' quarter in the lower district of the Braca salvage hub. He had become, through sustained and deliberate effort, exactly the kind of person nobody was looking for. This was the achievement of his adolescence. It had cost him something he did not have a name for yet, something in the register of aliveness, of presence, of the quality a person has when they are not spending the majority of their energy on remaining unfound. He knew it had cost him this. He had decided the cost was acceptable and made the payment without drama and continued. He was 18 years old. Prouf had been working in Section 14 of the salvage yards for 7 years, which meant he had been there before Cal arrived and would have been there without him, and the fact of their proximity was therefore accidental in origin and deliberate only in its continuation. They had been assigned to the same work detail in Cal's 3rd week. They had worked beside each other in silence for 3 shifts, before Prouf said anything that was not operationally necessary. What he said was, "You hold the ascender wrong." Cal had looked at his ascender. He held it the way he'd been shown in the guild orientation. "The orientation way," Prouf said, without looking at him, "puts the weight on the wrong part of your wrist. 4 hours into a shift, you'll feel it. 7 hours, you won't be able to ignore it. He demonstrated without offering, just adjusted his own grip in a visible way, allowing Cal to observe and decide. Cal adjusted his grip. He felt the difference immediately. The weight redistributed. His wrist settled into an angle that was sustainable in a way the previous angle had not been. He said nothing. Prauf said nothing. They worked. This was the beginning of the only friendship Cal had on Braca, which is to say the only relationship that had accumulated enough shared time and mutual tolerance to function as something more than transactional. They had not told each other much. What they had was something less fragile than confession and more durable than politeness. The knowledge that comes from existing beside someone through enough ordinary days that you develop an involuntary literacy in their habits, their silences, their specific quality of attention. Prauf knew Cal was hiding something. He had known it within the first month, because Prauf was not unintelligent, and the signs, if you were paying attention, were not subtle. The way Cal oriented himself in new spaces, the way his eyes moved before his head moved, the way he never sat with his back to an open area if a wall was available. These were not the habits of a salvage worker. These were the habits of someone who had learned to be aware of exits. Cal knew, Prauf knew. Neither mentioned it. This was the agreement that made the friendship possible. The mutual decision to inhabit only as much of each other's reality as the other person offered, and to leave the rest alone. They ate their guild rations in the same vicinity. They worked the same sections. When the shift was difficult, they worked around each other's difficulty without commenting on it. When something was occasionally, briefly, as something close to fine, they acknowledged it with the economy of two people who had learned not to invest heavily in fine. 5 years. Same section. Same tools. Same ration vendor. The friendship of people who had decided that showing up was sufficient and had kept showing up. The cable broke at 9:14. Not dramatically. Nothing about the preliminary moment was dramatic. A standard ascent operation. 3 workers on the exterior hull of a stripped cruiser in Section 11. A cable connector that had been rated for a load it was on the outer edge of actually supporting. The connector failed in the way that things fail when they have been asked to perform at the edge of their capacity for too long, which was a condition Braca produced in everything within it, tools and people equally. The worker who fell was named Cordova, which was not his real name, but the guild designation he'd been given, because his real name contained sounds that the guild's administrative system had been unable to process correctly. He was 43. He had worked Section 11 for 4 years. Cal knew his face the way he knew the faces of people he had been near enough long enough to recognize, not intimately, not with the accumulated knowledge of chosen relationship, but with the specific familiarity of shared proximity. He was falling. Cal reached. There was no deliberation, no calculation of risk versus necessity, no assessment of exposure versus consequence. The assessment did not happen because the reaching happened before the assessment could begin, before the conscious mind had finished processing cable broken, worker falling. The part of Cal that the Order had spent years cultivating and 5 years of deliberate suppression had not managed to eliminate had already responded. The Force answered. It answered completely, cleanly, without the hesitation that years of suppression might have produced in something less fundamental. It was not like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. It was like a language Cal had stopped speaking, but had never stopped understanding. The moment he reached for it, it was there, as fluent and immediate as it had always been, as if the 5 years of silence had changed nothing about the connection itself, only the duration of the silence. only the fact of how long he had been not speaking. Cordova stopped falling. He hung in the air for a moment, suspended, confused, unhurt. And then Cal released the connection, and Cordova's feet found the scaffold below him, and he grabbed the rail and stood there breathing. The silence that followed was immediate and total. 12 workers in Section 11. All of them had seen it. Some had seen it clearly. The angle was good. The light was adequate. There was no ambiguity about what had happened to the cable connector, and no ambiguity about what had happened to the worker who should have followed it down. Some had seen it peripherally, which in some ways was worse. The peripheral view left room for the mind to attempt an alternative explanation, and to fail, visibly, to produce one. They were all still. Cal stood on the hull, with his hand still partially extended, and felt the weight of what he had done settle into him, with the specific gravity of something that cannot be undone. Not regret. Regret was too small a word for the sensation, which was more like watching a door swing open that had been holding something back for a very long time. An understanding in the first second of the swing that it could not be closed again. The silence had a texture, not horror, not admiration, something between recognition and reckoning, the expression of people who understood simultaneously that they had witnessed something specific, and that the galaxy in which they lived had rules about specific things, and that those rules were not administered gently. Nobody moved. Then Prouf moved. He stepped forward from the position he'd been working in, 12 meters to Cal's left, and he did it with a deliberateness that was not the deliberateness of impulse. It was the deliberateness of someone who had made a decision somewhere in the 3 seconds since the cable broke, and was now executing the decision before he could reconsider it. He stepped forward, and he said, in a voice pitched to reach everyone in Section 11, that he had done it. He explained. He used the specific language of a man who had been working in salvage yards for 7 years, and knew the vocabulary of mechanical failure well enough to construct a plausible account of an implausible event. He said the connector had failed in a specific way, that the energy discharge from the failure had created a field effect, that this was a known phenomenon with certain connector types under certain load conditions. He said it without looking at Cal. He said it looking at the workers around him, making eye contact with each of them in turn, not asking for belief, asking for complicity, which was a different thing, and, in a galaxy run on imperial administrative oversight, a much more dangerous thing to ask for. He knew, as the words left his mouth, that it would not work. He said it anyway. He said it because it was the thing available to him to do, and Prouf was, at the foundation of his specific character, a person who did the available thing when the available thing was what was needed. Not the heroic thing, not the calculated thing. The available thing in the moment it was available, without waiting for the moment to become more convenient. The ISB response team's alert had been triggered by sensors before Prouf finished his second sentence. The sensors were automated. They did not require witnesses. They required only the specific energy signature of a force interaction with physical matter, which was a signature the Empire had spent 5 years calibrating its detection systems to recognize. Prouf's account was received by the workers with the careful expressions of people who were processing what they were being asked to hold, and were not yet certain whether they could hold it. It didn't matter. The alert was already sent. What happened to Prouf? The chapter will state plainly, and then hold still. The Inquisitors arrived before the end of the shift. The second sister came first. She always came first. Because she was faster. And because the ninth sister was slower, and because there was an established operational hierarchy that placed the second sister ahead on sensitivity intercepts, they came to Section 11. They asked with the specific quality of asking that was not a question, where the force-sensitive individual was. Prouf stepped forward. He said it was him. He had no force sensitivity. This was detectable in approximately 30 seconds by anyone with adequate training, which the second sister had in excess. She knew he was lying. He knew she knew. He stood there anyway. What happened after that was not recorded in the Scrapper Guild's incident log, which was sealed by ISB Administrative Order within the hour. It was not recorded in any document that survived the subsequent review of Section 11's personnel files. It is recorded here. And then the chapter holds still. Prouf had worked in the salvage yards for 7 years. He had corrected Cal's grip on an ascender in the 3rd week. He had eaten guild rations in the same vicinity as Cal for 5 years without ever requiring Cal to explain what he was hiding. He had stepped forward in Section 11 with the full knowledge of what stepping forward would cost, and he had done it anyway because it was the available thing, and he was the kind of person who did the available thing. He was 41 years old. He had a name the guild had not been able to process correctly. He is not in any imperial record. He is here. Cal ran. He ran through the lower levels of the Braca salvage hub with the force alive in him for the first time in 5 years. Not controlled, not suppressed, and not maintained at the careful working volume of someone managing an asset they cannot afford to display. Alive, present, moving through him the way it had moved through him before the compartment, before the corridor, before everything that had made suppression feel like the only survivable option. It was terrifying, not because it was painful, because it was natural, because after 5 years of deliberate distance from the most fundamental thing about himself, the return of that thing felt not like reunion, but like recognition, like catching sight of your own face in a surface you hadn't expected to be reflective. You knew the face. You had always known the face. The knowing did not make the seeing less disorienting. He moved through corridors and access tunnels and the exterior scaffolding of the lower yards with the specific efficiency of someone who had spent 5 years memorizing the geography of a place without being willing to admit why. He had memorized Braca's exits the way he had memorized the exits of every space he'd occupied since the Albedo Brave. Not consciously, not as a declared strategy, but as the involuntary mapping behavior of someone whose body had decided, 5 years ago, that knowing where the exits were was a non-negotiable baseline. His body had been right. He ran through the map he hadn't known he'd been making. Behind him, the second sister walked. She did not run. The second sister did not run because running was for people who were uncertain of the outcome, and she was not uncertain of the outcome. Braca's geography was in her mission briefing. The force-sensitive signature was in her awareness, moving through the salvage yards in patterns that told her more than the patterns themselves, told her the quality of the mind producing them, the years of suppression that had preceded the sudden re-emergence, the specific texture of someone who had been hiding for a long time and had just been found and was operating on the adrenaline of the found rather than the strategy of the prepared. She knew this texture. She walked through Section 11 toward the lower levels. She was accompanied by the ninth sister until she was not. She separated from her subordinate at the junction near the lower access, not because the separation was tactically necessary, but because she wanted to walk through the whole section alone. The ninth sister had learned through the specific education of working with someone who operated with particular consistency that certain requests were instructions regardless of their grammatical form. The hull section was a decommissioned Venator. She knew it was a Venator before she reached it. She knew from the briefing, from the section designation, from the specific curvature of the superstructure visible above the lower yard scaffolding. She had known it was going to be a Venator before she'd accepted the mission, because Bracca's primary salvage inventory was Venator-class vessels, because that was what the war had produced in the greatest quantity, because the Clone Wars had consumed Venators the way it had consumed everything else it touched, completely, without preservation. She stopped at the edge of the hull. She looked at the registry markings. They were partially obscured by 5 years of Bracca's weather. The specific erosion of a planet whose atmosphere was not hostile enough to destroy metal, but was persistent enough to blur it, to soften the edges of letters, to make the certain things uncertain over time. She could still read most of it. A number, a designation, a fleet assignment that no longer existed because the fleet no longer existed because the republic that had operated the fleet no longer existed. She stood at the edge, looked at the markings. The ninth sister, at the junction behind her, did not approach. What the second sister was looking for, standing at the edge of a dead Venator's hull on a salvage planet in the outer systems, was not in the mission briefing. It was not in any document. It did not have a designation or an objective or a measurable outcome. The chapter does not tell you what it was. It tells you only that she looked for it with the specific expression of someone who has been told, thoroughly and repeatedly, that what they are looking for does not exist, and who has not entirely believed the telling. She stood there for approximately 2 minutes. Then she turned and walked back toward the junction. In the dust of the lower access tunnel, the tunnel Cal had moved through 18 minutes before, moving fast, moving without looking back, the impression of a body was visible, not dramatically, just the accumulated evidence of someone having been in a particular position for long enough and often enough that the dust had conformed to the shape of them, the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of legs pulled up, the specific geometry of a person who had been still for a very long time, in a space small enough to require stillness. The second sister crouched beside it. She looked at it for a long moment. She knew the shape. She knew it the way you know something. You learned not from instruction, but from experience, from the inside of it, from having been the person whose shape it was, from having spent time in the dark of small spaces listening to things happening outside them and choosing not to reach. She knew, without any additional information, that whoever had been in this impression had been in it regularly, had returned to it, had chosen it not as emergency concealment, but as a place, a specific, selected, habitual place. The place you go when you need to be small and still and not findable. She knew this because she had had a place like this. She didn't think about that. She stood up. She looked down the tunnel in the direction the impression faced, the direction she understood that whoever had been here would have been watching, the direction of the approach, the direction from which something coming would first be visible. She stood in the tunnel for a moment. Then she moved. 2 images, simultaneous. Cal Kestis, running through the lower levels of Bracca's salvage hub. The force alive in him, terrifying in its naturalness. The sealed case under his arm because he had gone back for it before running. Because some things you don't leave even when you are leaving everything else. Running towards something he cannot name yet. Running in the direction of whatever comes after the hiding. Which is a direction he has not moved in for 5 years, and is moving in now because standing still was no longer available. the second sister, standing in the shape that the hiding had left behind, looking at it with the expression of someone who recognizes a thing they were told doesn't exist, not pursuing yet, standing, reading the impression the way you read something in a language you learned young and have not forgotten, even though you have spent years not using it. She knows the shape of hiding. She knows it in the way that cannot be taught and cannot be fully removed. In the body, in the specific angle of observation, in the patience that was not patience but survival practiced so long it became patience. And in the tunnel, in the dust, the impression was still there. Evidence of someone who had been still for a very long time. Evidence of someone who had finally moved. Chapter 6. What neither side recorded. The families of BRCA. The Imperial Security Bureau filed its BRCA sensitivity sweep under operational designation ISB 7712 BRACCA, which was a number generated automatically by the administrative system that processed force-sensitive incident reports across the Outer Rim territories. The number meant nothing in particular. It was sequential. It followed ISB 7711 and preceded ISB 7713, both of which were filed the same week and concerned entirely different planets and entirely different incidents and have no bearing on this story. The system that generated the numbers did not distinguish between them. To the system, they were equivalent units of administrative output, processed, filed, routed to the appropriate oversight office, acknowledged with an automated confirmation code, and added to the running total that the ISB's Outer Rim Division reported to Imperial Center at the end of each standard month. ISB 7712 BRACCA was acknowledged at 14:30 on the day after the Section 11 incident. The acknowledgement contained no additional information. It contained no questions. The Scrapper Guild's administrative office on BRCA occupied 3 rooms on the upper level of the hub's central processing building, a location chosen for its proximity to the Guild's weighing stations, rather than for any quality of the rooms themselves, which were functional in the way that administrative spaces were functional, when nobody had considered them as spaces where people spent time and had only considered them as spaces where paperwork was processed. The Guild administrator on duty when the ISB response team arrived was a human woman named Sarah On, who had worked for the Guild for 11 years and had processed approximately 14,000 employment files in that time and had never been present for a file seizure. The response team presented the seizure order. She read it. She processed it the way she processed everything. Methodically, beginning at the top, moving to the bottom, noting the authorization codes and the scope parameters and the specific sections being flagged. The scope was Section 11, current roster, previous 18 months. She pulled the files. There were 43 of them. She handed them over. The response team lead signed the transfer receipt and gave her a copy and told her that the flagged personnel would be contacted directly by ISB for follow-up, and that the Guild should make no effort to contact those individuals in the interim, and that compliance with this instruction was not optional. She said she understood. She filed her copy of the transfer receipt in the administrative archive where transfer receipts went. She did not know, in that moment, how many of the 43 files would result in follow-up. She learned, over the following weeks, by watching which workers returned to the shift roster and which ones did not. It was not a scientific count. She was not tracking it deliberately. She simply noticed, the way administrators notice the presence and absence of names in systems they manage daily, that some of the 43 came back and some did not. She did not file a report about the ones who did not come back. There was no form for that. Jaya 34 of the 43 workers returned to active duty within 2 weeks of the sweep. This is the record that exists. 34 names appearing in the Guild's post-sweep shift rosters, their files returned with ISB clearance notations, their employment status unchanged. 34 people who were questioned and processed and released back into the administrative machinery of the Braca salvage hub, who returned to their sections and their tools and their ration cards, who ate at the same vendors and filed the same guild reports, and did not, in any observable way, speak about what had happened during the interim period. 9 did not return. This number, 9, comes from a single source. A guild payroll record predating the sweep by 3 weeks. She found 17 years later in the data archives of a salvage vessel operating in the Anoat sector. The vessel had acquired a batch of Braca administrative records as part of a data salvage operation. The kind of incidental acquisition that happens when ships collect anything recoverable from derelict stations, when the value of the data is assessed by volume rather than content, when nobody examines the specifics of what they have until someone, years later, goes looking. Someone went looking. What they found was a payroll record from Section 11, Braca Scrapper Guild, covering the period 3 weeks before the sweep. 43 names. 43 workers in the relevant sections during the relevant period. 9 of those names do not appear in any subsequent guild document. They do not appear in imperial records that have been accessed by researchers working from available archives. They do not appear in the ISB's Outer Rim division monthly reports for the relevant period, which is not unusual. The ISB's monthly reports did not itemize individuals, only aggregate numbers under category headings. They appear in the payroll record. They do not appear after it. The 9 were not exceptional people in the way that makes records. This is the thing that needs to be understood. They were not operatives. They were not resistance members. They were not, as far as any available documentation suggests, connected to any network or organization or cause that would have attracted attention independent of the sweep. They were salvage workers on a planet that processed the wreckage of a war, doing the work the planet offered, living the lives the work made possible. Some of them had been in Section 11 for years. Some had transferred in recently. One had worked beside Prouf for 4 years, which means he had worked beside Cal for 4 years, without either of them knowing what that proximity would eventually cost him. His name in the payroll record is listed as Darvan, a guild designation like Prouf's, like Cordova's, the shortened and processed version of something the administrative system had decided it could handle. Darvan, 4 years in Section 11, noted in his file according to the transfer receipt category codes under behavioral anomaly, a notation the ISB applied to workers who had reported unusual observations, had interacted with flagged individuals for extended periods, or had demonstrated what the ISB's assessment rubric classified as potential complicity awareness. Cal had eaten his guild rations within 4 meters of Devan approximately 900 times. He did not know Devan's name. He knew his face. He will not know, reading this, if he reads this, that the face is one of the 9. The script does not know if he ever learned. The script does not know if any of the 34 who returned told the ones who left in time what had happened to the ones who didn't come back. The script does not know what the workers of Section 11 told each other in the weeks after the sweep, or whether they told each other anything, or whether the silence that descended on the section afterward was the silence of people who had been warned, or the silence of people who had witnessed something they had no framework for processing and had chosen, by collective unspoken agreement, to not process it in public. The script does not know. The record was not kept. What Prouf's death means in this context requires saying plainly. Prouf was one person the chapter has named, one face with a history. 7 years in Section 11, a corrected grip on an ascender. 5 years of proximity to Cal conducted with the specific dignity of someone who knew the rules of the arrangement and kept them. He was one person the listener had met, in the way that you meet people in a story, briefly, specifically, with enough detail to recognize them. The 9 are the faces behind him. This is not metaphor. The 9 are the people who were always in the background of the chapters. The workers in Section 11 who were present when the cable broke, who watched the silence afterward, who heard Prouf's explanation and processed what it meant and returned to their work because what else do you do? They were always there. They were always part of the world Cal was hiding in. They existed before the story noticed them, and they existed after. And then, in the space between a payroll record and the next document that should contain their names, they stopped existing in any form that the record keeps. The script puts them here. The script does not explain what happened to them. The script will not guess. It will only say that there were 9 of them, and that they had names the administrative system had processed into something shorter, and that they had worked in the salvage yards of Braca because that was the work the galaxy had offered them, and that the galaxy had offered them this work in part because the war that Cal Kestis had survived had produced so much wreckage that entire planets had been organized around the processing of it. They were, in a specific and unrecorded way, casualties of the same event that had produced the wreckage they spent their working lives dismantling. The script holds still. The second sister filed her report at 2300 ship time in the cockpit of the Inquisitor transport that had carried her to Braca and was now carrying her away from it. The cockpit was dark except for the console lighting, the specific blue-white of instrument panels in the low-power configuration of a ship in transit, which gave the space the quality of being underwater, or of being inside something that had not decided yet whether it was a room or a machine. She wrote the report with the focused efficiency she brought to all administrative tasks, which was the same focused efficiency she brought to operational tasks. She did not distinguish between them in terms of attention allocated, having decided early in her career as an inquisitor that the distinction between important and unimportant tasks was a distinction made by people who had not yet understood that the quality of a record was as consequential as the quality of the action the record described. The report contained the nature of the incident, the force-sensitive signature and its characteristics, strength, training level estimated, suppression period estimated at 4 to 6 years based on signature quality, the pursuit parameters, the outcome of the pursuit, which was listed as target evaded initial contact, pursuit ongoing, probability of reacquisition assessed at high, the operational status of the 9th sister and any associated assets, the condition of the Braca staging area post-sweep. The report did not contain the 9. They were not in her operational scope. She was the Inquisitorius. She hunted force sensitives. The administrative processing of civilian witnesses was an ISB function conducted by ISB personnel, filed under ISB designations. The boundary between these two functions was clear and was maintained with the same precision that all boundaries in the imperial apparatus were maintained. Not because the maintenance was difficult, but because the maintenance was the point. Clearly defined functions produced clearly defined accountability, and clearly defined accountability produced a system in which nobody was responsible for the whole because everyone was responsible for their part. The 9 were someone else's part. She did not list them. She completed the report. She submitted it through the encrypted channel to the Inquisitorius command relay, received the automated acknowledgement, and closed the report file. Then she sat. The cockpit was dark. The instrument panels ran their blue-white cycle. Outside, the Braca system receded at sublight, not yet jumped. The planet still visible in the rear sensor array as a brownish-grey sphere whose surface, from this altitude, showed nothing of what it contained. No detail of the salvage yards, no section designations, no indication that 9 names had stopped appearing in documents somewhere on its surface. She sat and she looked at nothing. The chapter does not tell you what she was thinking. Some silences exist in this story that are not for interpretation. Not because the content is hidden, but because the content is genuinely uncertain. Because the person sitting in the silence had not resolved the content into something that could be named, was sitting in the unresolved state of it, was occupying the specific experience of having completed a task and being, briefly, in the space between the completion and the next one. She sat in that space. She looked at nothing. The transport continued its sublight egress from the Braca system. Somewhere in the forward hold, her mission gear was stowed and logged and ready for the next deployment. Somewhere on the planet behind her, a payroll record existed in a guild administrative archive that nobody had thought to flag as significant. She did not know about the payroll record. She would not have needed to know. On the Stinger Mantis, Cal Kestis sat in the common area and did not sleep. The ship had jumped to hyperspace 40 minutes ago. The viewport showed the white-blue constant, the same light, the same character of revealing nothing that every hyperspace viewport showed, that made the journey feel both infinite and suspended, both moving and perfectly still. He had not yet fully understood who Siri was. He understood pieces. She was a Jedi. Had been, was still, in some configuration he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, because the configurations the Order had offered didn't quite map onto whatever she currently was. She had a past that she had not fully described and that he had not yet asked about, which was the agreement of the first hours of an arrangement that neither party had fully committed to yet. The provisional politeness of people who are going to need to trust each other and are not there yet. She wanted him to do something. He understood the outlines, a holocron, a list, Jedi children, hidden, surviving in a galaxy that had been redesigned to find and eliminate exactly them. He understood the outlines. He sat in the common area and he thought about Prauf. Not the specifics of what had happened in Section 11, which he had not fully processed and was not going to fully process tonight. The specifics were too recent and too heavy to carry in their complete form. What he thought about was the grip, the ascender. The third week, when Prauf had demonstrated the adjustment without offering it, allowing Cal to observe and decide. He thought about that. He thought about Devan, though he didn't know Devan's name. Thought about the face across the yard, one of the faces he'd been not reading for 5 years. One of the faces that had been present in every shift and absent from his deliberate attention. Because deliberate attention was the thing he had been conserving for survival, and there had been nothing left for the faces around him. He didn't know what had happened to the faces around him. He did not know about the 9 yet. He would find out. Not tonight. Not in a form that gave him the number or the payroll record or the specific administrative designation of what had been done. He would find out the way you find out about things that happened in the vicinity of your hiding, through the accumulation of absences, through the spaces in later conversations where information should have been and wasn't, through the specific texture of people who knew what had happened and had decided not to say it directly because saying it directly was too expensive. He would carry it when he found it. He would add it to what he was already carrying. Tonight, he sat in the common area of a ship he had been on for less than a day, moving through hyperspace toward a mission he had not agreed to and had not refused. And he thought about the grip on an ascender and what it costs to be the kind of person who shows you the correct way to hold the tool without making you feel like you've been holding it wrong. The sealed case was on the seat beside him. He had not opened it. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the viewport. The hyperspace light ran its constant cycle. The 9 were behind him, in a document in an archive on a planet he was leaving. Not recorded, not explained, not resolved into any form that the record kept or the story could properly close. They were simply there, in the space between confirmed facts, in the weight that travels forward without being acknowledged as weight, in every chapter after this one, in the specific way that things you don't account for continue to exist in the accounting, present in the gaps, permanent in their absence, unreckoned, and therefore, she in the particular arithmetic of the galaxy never fully paid. What happened to the 9 workers whose names appear in the Section 11 payroll record and do not appear in any subsequent document was never recorded by either side. The Inquisitorius does not document what it considers administrative. The resistance networks that would have noticed did not yet know to look. 9 names in the before, nothing after. The script does not know. The script will not guess. It will only carry them forward. The people who designed the Inquisitorius never visited Braca. They never visited Kashyyyk either, where Cal moved through Imperial-chained Wookiees, whose bondage was the direct result of decisions made in rooms on Coruscant, by people who had assessed an entire civilization as a resource problem and solved it accordingly. The people in those rooms had good lighting and comfortable chairs, and access to every record the Republic had ever kept about the Jedi Order, its structure, its pressure points, the specific places where its own ethics made it vulnerable. They had studied carefully. The Inquisitorius was not improvised. This is the thing Cal began to understand on Kashyyyk, moving through a planet that had been redesigned by people who were never going to see it. The program had been planned before Order 66 was transmitted, perhaps long before, in the unhurried way that people plan things when they have already decided on the outcome and are only arranging the mechanism. Find the survivors. Break them at the specific place the Order had built them strongest. Use what remained. The second sister knew this. This was the most disturbing thing about her. She could name every technique that had been used on her. She knew the sequence. She understood the architecture of what had been done to her mind and continued to operate inside it anyway, because the alternative was to feel the full weight of it at once, and that was not something she had yet found a way to survive. On the Mantis, Siri told Cal what she had done during her imprisonment, not as confession, as fact. She had reached into the dark side because the pain had made the word decision almost meaningless, and what came through had cost her the Force connection she'd been protecting, and then had cost her Triller. She did not call it a mistake. She called it what it was, a choice made in conditions that had been deliberately designed to make the right choice impossible. Cal received this the way young people receive things too large for the moment. He set it aside. It would grow heavier the longer he carried it without examining it. He knew this and set it aside anyway, because Kashyyyk was immediate and the Wookiees needed what help he could give, and Zire's history was something he would have to return to when he had the room. He did not yet have the room. Zire, meanwhile, held the holocron's purpose in both hands without resolving it. The list of force-sensitive children, the possibility of rebuilding, the equal possibility that rebuilding meant making more targets, more Padawans who could be broken into more Inquisitors. She did not resolve it. She continued anyway. On Zepho, moving through ruins older than the Empire, Cal reached out, not deliberately, not searching, and felt something at the edge of his perception. A presence. A convergence coming. He pulled his hand back. He was working on learning to trust what he felt. He was not there yet. Fortress Inquisitorius sat above the ocean moon of Nur, the way a fist sits above a table. Not resting, not settled, positioned with the specific intention of demonstrating what it could do to whatever was beneath it. Cal had been inside it for 40 minutes. He had the holocron. He stood in a corridor that the fortress's designers had built for function rather than comfort. Everything here was built for function rather than comfort, which was itself a design philosophy, a statement about what the people who built it believed comfort was for and who deserved it. The holocron was in his hand, small, warm in the way Kyber-adjacent objects were warm, not temperature, something else. The specific aliveness of something that had been made with intention and still carried it. He knew what was on it. Children, names, locations, the surviving force-sensitive young of a galaxy that had been systematically searched for exactly them. Eno Cordova had spent years finding them, hiding them, encoding their locations in a device that required a Jedi to open. A lock built from the assumption that the only people who could access this information were the people who could be trusted with it. Cal was trusted with it. He stood in the corridor and held both possibilities simultaneously. Use it, find them, train them, build something from what remained, which was what Siri had asked him to do, what the entire journey to this fortress had been structured around, what the deaths and the running and the Wookiees on Kashyyyk and Prauf in Section 11 had been, in some terrible accounting, in service of, or destroy it. She removed the list, protect the children by making them unfindable, which was the only protection that had actually worked in the 5 years since Order 66. Not gathering, not training, but stillness and silence, and the hope that what was hidden stayed hidden. He was 17 years old. He made the choice he made. The chapter does not judge it. It only notes that it was made by someone doing his best with information too large for any one person, in a corridor in a fortress above an ocean, with the weight of 9 names in a payroll record and 1 name on an ascender, and a sealed case carried for 5 years pressing on every calculation he attempted. He made the choice. In a different room, in the same fortress, Trilla Suduri had Siri Junda within reach. She had held this advantage for longer than the Inquisitorius would have considered acceptable, which was itself information about what she was still capable of, about what the years of construction had not fully eliminated. She had pressed every advantage in every mission before this one, with the efficiency the title required. She had not pressed this one. The reason had always been there, in the specific silences she kept around the edges of this particular operation, in the moments where she could have moved faster and had not. She was, underneath everything the fortress had made of her, still a person who had once argued about texts she hadn't finished reading and turned out to be right about them anyway. That person was not gone. The construction had been built on top of her, not instead of her, and the distinction, which the Inquisitorius had believed was academic, was not academic. She gave Siri the force connection she had been withholding, not as mercy. The chapter is careful about this. Mercy was too clean, too resolved, too much like an ending. What she gave was something closer to need. The specific need of a person who has been carrying the imperial version of their own story for 5 years, and requires, before whatever comes next, for one person to hold the true version. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness was too large and too abstract and required more time than this corridor had. Just know what happened. Have the true version. Hold it. Siri received it. The mirror landed here, quietly, without announcement. Cal, in his corridor, making a choice shaped by T'Pol. Protect the targets by removing the target. Trilla, and in hers, making a choice shaped by Siri. The truth matters more than survival. Both choices were recognizably Jedi choices, made by people who had been told thoroughly that they were no longer Jedi. The Empire had understood how to break the institution. It had not understood that the institution was not where the tradition lived. The tradition lived here, in two people making Jedi decisions in a fortress built to prevent exactly that. This was what the Empire never fully understood. Then Vader arrived. The chapter does not linger. It states it the way facts are stated, when elaboration would diminish them. He arrived, and Trilla's face, in the moment she understood what his arrival meant, contained everything the chapter needs to convey, without requiring the chapter to convey it. She knew what she was, what she had been made to be, what she had just failed to be, in the way she had been built to prevent. She knew that none of this, named or unnamed, would change what came next. She had chosen truth over survival. The choice could not be taken back from the person who made it. Cal and Siri went into the water. The ocean around Nur was dark in the specific way of deep water that has never needed to accommodate visibility. Absolute, cold, directionally meaningless. Going under, there was no reliable up, no reliable surface, only the direction of movement and the trust that movement towards something was better than stillness in the dark. The surface broke. Sky returned. The mantis waited. Below them, something was already finished. They did not say what. They pulled themselves aboard, and the ship moved, and the water closed behind them as water closes, completely, soon immediately, without preserving the shape of what had passed through it. The next chapter begins already knowing what was left beneath. The holocron was gone, not lost, not taken. Gone by Cal's own hand, which was a different kind of gone, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, that exists in the memory of the decision rather than the fact of the absence. He had held it and he had made the choice, and now it was not there, and the children whose names had been inside it were safe in the specific way that things are safe when nobody can find them, which was the only safety currently on offer in the galaxy the Empire had built. Siri did not speak about it directly. She spoke around it, about the next thing, about Cal's training, about what the mantis needed, about Grease's navigation logs, and Merrin's adjustment to a ship that was smaller than any space she had previously been required to inhabit. She occupied herself with forward motion, because forward motion was what she had instead of resolution, and she had made her peace with that substitution years ago. She taught without calling it teaching. This was the thing she had learned from her own master, that the most durable instruction happened in the margins, in the borrowed spaces of the day, using whatever was at hand. On the mantis, what was at hand was the common area, a cleared cargo section. Whatever stretch of floor wasn't occupied by Grease's navigation equipment or Merrin's reading. She and Cal worked in these spaces, improvised. Low stakes in mechanics, High stakes in everything underneath the mechanics. Cal was different now, not transformed. Transformation was too clean a word for what had happened to him, which was more like the removal of a long-held tension. The release of something he'd been bracing against for so long. The bracing had become invisible to him. He was using the Force without suppressing it. This meant he was also using everything the Force held for him. T'Pol's absence, present in the connection, like a frequency always playing beneath other sounds. Prauf, the Nine, the weight that the Force did not filter or reduce, but simply held alongside everything else. Because the Force was not a comfort mechanism. It was a connection. And connection meant feeling what was actually there. He was learning he might not need to separate the power from the weight, that carrying was itself a form of strength, if you found the right way to hold the load. The Mantis crew had not chosen each other. Grease had chosen credits, initially. Padawan had stayed for reasons he had not fully articulated and would not articulate, which was consistent with his general approach to anything resembling sentiment. Merrin had chosen to leave Dathomir, which was different from choosing where she went, and the Mantis had been the available direction. Cal had been found rather than arrived. None of them fit together in the way that designed things fit together. They fit together the way broken pieces sometimes fit, at the irregular edges, in the specific places where one person's damage accommodated another's in a way that function was possible. Not comfort, not always, but function, presence. The ship occupied in the way ships need to be occupied to feel like something more than a vessel. Merrin and Cal did not speak much about their parallel losses. The Night Sisters of Dathomir and the Jedi Order were not the same thing, and the chapter does not suggest they were. But loss of that specific scale, the loss of everyone who knew what you were before the world decided to eliminate what you were, had a shape that both of them recognized in the other without requiring it to be named. They existed on the same ship. They acknowledged each other's presence with the particular attention of people who understand that presence itself is something after sufficient loss. This was enough. Somewhere between Nur and wherever came next, Cal found a quiet stretch of cargo floor and sat down on it. He was not meditating. He did not have the architecture of formal meditation available to him in the way the temple would have provided it. What he had was the memory of a habit that had no name, the stillness after training, the 5 minutes that T'Pol had never explained, and Cal had never fully understood, and had filed under things that don't need names to be worth doing. He sat in the stillness. He didn't know if he was doing it right. He had no reference point for right. T'Pol was not at the end of the cargo floor to stand in the same silence and confirm through his presence that the silence was the point. There was only Cal and the ship's ambient hum and the specific quality of a moment not filled with anything. He sat anyway, approximately 5 minutes. Not because it worked. He couldn't have said afterward whether it worked in any measurable sense. He sat because the doing of it was the point, because somewhere in the accumulation of these 5 minutes was the specific form of continuity available to him. Not the order, not the temple, not the institution that had held this practice for 25,000 years and no longer existed. Just the practice itself, traveling forward in the only vehicle still moving. Him. He sat until the 5 minutes were done. Then he stood up and went back to the common area where Grease was arguing with the navigation system, and Merrin was reading something she would not show anyone. And Siri was at the fold-down table doing the work of whatever came next. He sat down. He was present. The Mantis entered hyperspace. The viewport ran its white-blue constant. The same light, the same character, the same quality of revealing nothing and carrying everything forward. Cal was awake, not anxious, not grieving at a volume that prevented function. Just awake. He watched the light and thought about what he had left behind and what it was worth and what you did with worth you could not spend. He did not answer the question tonight. He let it sit in the stillness where answers developed at their own pace. Outside, the hyperspace light ran on.